The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of the small-town library as Susan Clark reshuffled the newly returned books onto their proper shelves. Her fingers traced the spines with care, the way they had done for the past 11 years. At 47, Susan had settled into a life of quiet routine in Millfield, a town so small it barely registered on most maps. "Miss Clark, do you have any new mystery novels this week?" Mrs. Patel asked, her walking cane tapping gently against the worn carpet. The elderly woman visited every Thursday without fail. Susan smiled warmly. "I set aside that new one you've been waiting for. Just came in yesterday." She reached under the desk and pulled out a book with a midnight blue cover. These small interactions were the highlights of Susan's workdays, simple moments of connection in her otherwise solitary life. After Mrs. Patel left, Susan glanced at the clock. Her shift ended at noon, giving her just enough time to pick up groceries before heading home to check on her mother. Since her father's passing 3 years ago, Susan had moved back to her childhood home to care for her mom, whose arthritis made living alone increasingly difficult. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked Beth, her co-worker and the closest thing Susan had to a friend in recent years. Beth was everything Susan wasn't, outspoken, bold, and always pushing Susan to live a little more. "You're early today," Susan commented, noticing Beth wasn't due for another hour. Beth's eyes sparkled, with excitement, a look Susan had learned to be wary of. "I have something to show you." She placed her coffee down and pulled out a wrinkled flyer from her purse. "The Golden Voice competition is coming to Westbrook next month. They're holding auditions in 2 weeks. Susan barely glanced at the paper. "That's nice. Maybe your niece would be interested. She's taking singing lessons, right?" Beth rolled her eyes. "Not for my niece. For you." Susan froze, her hand mid-reach for a book. "Me? That's ridiculous." "Is it? I've heard you sing when you think no one's around. Sometimes when you're shelving in the back corner, you hum or sing softly. Susan, you have a gift." Heat crept up Susan's neck. It's nothing." She turned away, pretending to organize a stack of already perfectly arranged pamphlets. The truth was, singing had been Susan's private joy since childhood. Her father had been the church choir director, and those Sunday mornings standing beside him, lifting her voice among the congregation, had been precious. But after high school, life happened. Her mother's first health scare, college plans abandoned. To save money, a brief engagement that ended poorly. Somewhere along the way, Susan's singing became a private thing, something she did while washing dishes or driving alone, or occasionally at the church when they were short a choir member. "Look," Beth said, sliding the flyer closer. "Just think about it. The winner gets $5,000 and a chance to perform at the State Arts Festival. Even the finalists get some prize money." Money. That caught Susan's attention. Her mother's medication costs had been rising, and the old house needed a new roof before winter. Still, the idea of standing on a stage. "I can't, Beth. I've never performed like that. I don't have training or fancy clothes or—" "Susan Clark, you're making excuses." Beth's voice was gentle but firm. "You're afraid, and that's okay. But don't let fear rob you of something that could be amazing." Susan sighed. "Even if I wanted to, the application deadline is probably already taken care of." Beth grinned mischievously. "What? You didn't?" "I did. I sent in your information last week. They review applications first, then send invitations to audition." Beth reached into her purse again and pulled out an envelope. "And guess what came in the mail yesterday?" Susan stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Her name was printed on the front in elegant script. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read the formal invitation to audition for the Golden Voice competition. 2 Saturdays from now. "Beth, I can't believe you did this," she whispered. A confusing mix of terror and something that felt strangely like excitement churned in her stomach. "What's the worst that could happen?" Beth asked. "You don't have to go if you truly don't want to. But Susan, I've known you for 8 years, and I've never seen your eyes light up the way they do when you sing, even when you think no one's listening." That evening, Susan sat at her kitchen table long after her mother had gone to bed. The invitation lay before her, along with an old photo album she hadn't opened in years. She flipped through pages of faded photographs until she found what she was looking for. A picture of herself at 16, holding a trophy from a school talent show. Her father stood beside her, his face beaming with pride. It was the last time she'd performed for an audience larger than her shower walls. "What would you tell me to do, Dad?" she whispered to the photo. The house creaked in response, the familiar sounds of the old structure settling. Susan closed her eyes and let herself remember the feeling. The rush of connecting with music, of letting her voice become the pure expression of something larger than herself. Even in her small church choir, she'd always held back, never wanting to stand out or draw attention. What would it feel like to truly let go, to sing without restraint? The next morning, Susan called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead, she drove to the edge of town where an old farmhouse stood surrounded by overgrown gardens. She knocked on the peeling door, heart pounding. Mrs. Peterson, her high school music teacher, now in her 70s, answered with wide-eyed surprise. "Susan Clark, goodness, it's been ages." "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," Susan began, suddenly feeling foolish. I need some advice." Over tea served in chipped cups, Susan explained about the competition and her fears. Mrs. Peterson listened without interrupting, her kind eyes studying Susan's face. "Sing something for me," the older woman said when Susan finished speaking. "Anything you like." Susan hesitated, then closed her eyes. She chose an old hymn her father had loved, one she knew by heart. The first notes came out shaky, but as the familiar melody wrapped around her, her voice strengthened. She sang simply, without ornament, letting the words carry their own weight. When she opened her eyes, Mrs. Peterson was wiping away a tear. "My dear, why have you been hiding that voice away? It's even more beautiful than I remember." "I'm not trained like the other contestants will be," Susan said. "They'll all be younger, more polished. And not one of them will have what you have," Mrs. Peterson replied, reaching for Susan's hand. "Technical skill can be learned, but the soul in your voice? That's a rare gift." For the next 2 weeks, Susan visited Mrs. Peterson every evening after work. They chose a song, a classic ballad that showcased Susan's rich tone and emotional depth. They worked on breath control and phrasing, things Susan had never consciously thought about before. At home, Susan practiced in whispers after her mother went to sleep, not wanting to explain or face questions. But the night before the audition, her mother caught her singing in the kitchen. "I haven't heard you sing like that since your father was alive," her mother said from the doorway, startling Susan into silence. "He always said you had the voice of an angel." Susan felt tears prick her eyes. "I have an audition tomorrow," she admitted, "for a singing competition. Beth signed me up." Instead of the discouragement Susan expected, her mother smiled. "Well, it's about time. What are you wearing?" The next morning dawned bright and clear. Susan stood before her closet, anxiety churning in her stomach. She hadn't told her mother how big the competition was, how professional the other contestants would be. What had seemed possible in Mrs. Peterson's cozy living room now felt like madness. She selected her best outfit, a simple blue dress she wore to church on Easter, and carefully applied a touch of makeup. As she fastened her mother's pearl earrings, a gift for her 40th birthday, the phone rang. "Just calling to wish you luck," Beth said. "You're going to be amazing." "Or I'll make a complete fool of myself," Susan replied, her voice tight. "Either way, I'll be there to drive you home. That's what friends are for." As Susan hung up, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back looked ordinary in every way, graying hair pulled into a neat bun, lines beginning to form around her eyes. Nothing that would make anyone look twice if they passed her on the street. But today, something different flickered in her eyes, something that looked almost like courage. She picked up her purse, the invitation tucked carefully inside, and headed for the door. Whatever happened today would at least make for a good story. The Day Susan Clark, small-town librarian, stepped out of her comfort zone and onto a stage where dreams either soared or crashed spectacularly. Either way, she wouldn't have to wonder, what if, anymore. The Westbrook Community Arts Center stood, tall and imposing, its glass doors reflecting the morning sunlight as Susan climbed the stone steps. Her stomach twisted into knots with each step. Beside her, Beth chattered excitedly, seemingly oblivious to Susan's growing panic. "There are so many people," Susan whispered, clutching her registration papers. The lobby bustled with activity, young, performers warming up their voices in corners, parents fussing over their children's outfits, and confident-looking adults reviewing sheet music. "Of course there are. This is a big deal," Beth replied, scanning the crowd. "But none of them are you. Remember what Mrs. Peterson said?" Susan nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. During their last practice session, Mrs. Peterson had held Susan's trembling hands and said, "When you sing from your heart, no one can touch you, not even yourself." A volunteer at the registration desk handed Susan a number, 47, and directed them toward a waiting area. "Contestants only beyond this point," the young man said apologetically to Beth. Beth squeezed Susan's arm. "I'll be right here when you're done. Just breathe and be yourself." Susan forced a smile and followed the signs to a large hall with rows of chairs. Most were already filled with contestants. She found an empty seat in the back row and sat down, trying to make herself as small as possible. All around her, people were practicing scales, applying last-minute makeup, or scrolling through phones. A group of 20-somethings nearby were comparing conservatory experiences. 2 seats over, a teenager with bright blue hair was recording a social media video about being at the auditions. First time? Susan turned to find a kind-faced woman, about her age, in the seat beside her. "Is it that obvious?" Susan asked. The woman smiled. "I've been exactly where you are. 3 years ago, I couldn't even speak when they called my name. I'm Nancy, by the way." "Susan." They shook hands. Did you get through? 3 years ago? Made it to the second round? Felt like winning the lottery?" Nancy leaned closer. "The trick is to not look at the judges. Find a spot on the back wall and sing to it." Before Susan could respond, the doors at the front of the hall opened. A stern-looking woman with a clipboard entered. "Welcome to the preliminary auditions for the Golden Voice competition," she announced. "I'm Diane Wells, the competition coordinator. We have over 200 contestants today, so we'll be moving quickly. When your number is called, proceed to the audition room. You'll have exactly 90 seconds to perform. The judges will not be providing feedback at this stage. 200 contestants. The number hit Susan like a physical blow. What had she been thinking? She glanced at the exit, calculating how quickly she could slip away. As if reading her mind, Nancy whispered, "Don't you dare. You'll regret it forever if you run now." The first group of numbers was called. Susan watched as 10 contestants followed Diane out. 15 minutes later, they returned, some beaming, others fighting back tears. The pattern continued through the morning. Susan observed each returning group, trying to guess who had impressed the judges. Her palms grew sweaty as her number drew closer. "Numbers 41 through 50. Please follow me." Susan's legs felt like lead as she stood. Nancy gave her a thumbs up as she walked past. The hallway to the audition room seemed endless. Susan focused on her breathing, the way Mrs. Peterson had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The audition room was actually a small theater with a stage at the front. 3 judges sat at a table, their faces illuminated by desk lamps. The rest of the room was dim, but Susan could make out a few dozen people in the audience. Staff, volunteers, and contestants from earlier groups. "Please line up along the wall according to your numbers," Diane instructed. "When called, state your name and what you'll be performing. Begin when ready." Susan stood at the end of the line, watching as each contestant took their turn. Some were clearly professionals, their voices technically flawless. Others were good but forgettable. One young man forgot his lyrics halfway through and walked off the stage in tears. Number 47. The moment arrived too quickly. Susan walked to center stage, the spotlight blinding her. She could barely make out the judges' faces. "Name and selection, please," said a crisp male voice. "Susan Clark," she said, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Susan Clark, I'll be singing Bridge Over Troubled Water." There was a pause, followed by a derisive snort from the center judge. "Really? That song again?" Susan squinted against the spotlight. The center judge came into focus, a man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive-looking glasses. She recognized him from the competition materials. Julian Reed, renowned vocal coach and music producer. Yes," Susan stammered. Let me guess," Julian interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "You sing in your church choir and everyone tells you you've got a wonderful voice." Heat rushed to Susan's face. "Sometimes, yes." Julian exchanged glances with the other judges, a middle-aged woman with a severe bun and a younger man who looked bored. "And what do you do when you're not blessing the church with your talents?" The question felt like a trap, but Susan answered, "Honestly, I work at the library in Millfield, and I take care of my mother." "A librarian," Julian repeated, making it sound like the most ridiculous occupation imaginable. He looked down at some papers, then back at Susan, taking in her simple, blue dress and sensible shoes. "Let me save us all some time, Ms. Clark. This competition attracts serious performers from across the region. People who have trained for years, who understand what it means to be an artist." Susan stood frozen under the harsh light. She was aware of murmurs from the audience, of the other contestants watching her humiliation. "I don't mean to be unkind," Julian continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But look at yourself. A middle-aged librarian from, where was it? Millfield, wearing what I assume is your Sunday best, about to sing one of the most overdone songs in the competition circuit." The female judge touched Julian's arm, whispering something, but he waved her off. "We see dozens of women like you every year. Housewives, secretaries, teachers who think singing along to the radio qualifies them to perform on stage. It's not just a waste of our time. It's cruel to let you believe you belong here." Each word hit Susan like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The younger judge cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should let her sing, Julian." Julian sighed dramatically. "Fine. 90 seconds, Ms. Clark, though I suspect that will be more than enough." Susan stood paralyzed. The music should have started by now, but she hadn't even given her sheet music to the accompanist. All those eyes on her, all those judgments. She thought she might be sick right there on the stage. "Whenever you're ready," Julian said, his tone making it clear he expected disaster. Susan glanced toward the exit door, her escape route. Then, for reasons she couldn't explain, she looked back at the judges. The woman was watching her with what might have been sympathy. The younger man looked uncomfortable, and Julian was already writing something on his notepad, having dismissed her before she'd sung a single note. A strange feeling rose in Susan's chest, cutting through the humiliation. She'd driven 2 hours to get here. She'd practiced every day for 2 weeks. Mrs. Peterson had believed in her. Beth had believed in her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. She nodded to the accompanist and handed over her music. The opening chords filled the theater. Susan opened her mouth and nothing came out. Her throat had closed, strangled by anxiety and shame. The accompanist repeated the introduction, giving her another chance. Susan took a deep breath, fixed her eyes on a point high on the back, and tried again. The first notes came out wobbly and thin. She could almost feel Julian's satisfaction. But then, halfway through the first verse, something inside her crumpled. What was the point? He was right. She didn't belong here. Susan stopped singing mid-phrase. The accompanist faltered, uncertain whether to continue. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered into the microphone. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." She turned to leave the stage, blinking back tears that threatened to spill over. From the judges' table came the sound of papers shuffling. "Well, that was predictable," Julian said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Next, please, number 48. Susan walked off the stage, her legs somehow carrying her despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. In the wings, she passed the next contestant, a young woman who averted her eyes as if Susan's failure might be contagious. The hallway back to the waiting area was mercifully empty. Susan leaned against the wall, finally allowing the tears to come. What had she been thinking? Julian was right. She was just a small-town librarian with delusions of being something more. When she eventually made her way back to the lobby, Beth jumped up from her seat. How did it go? Did they? Beth stopped, seeing Susan's face. Oh, Susan, can we just go? Please? Susan whispered, aware of curious glances from others in the lobby. The drive home passed in near silence. Susan stared out the window, the countryside blurring through her tears. Beth tried to comfort her, but the words washed over Susan without sinking in. He humiliated me, Susan finally said as they neared Millfield. In front of everyone. He didn't even let me finish. Who? Beth demanded, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Julian Reed, the famous one. He... Susan's voice broke. He said I was wasting their time, that it was cruel to let me believe I belonged there. Beth pulled the car over suddenly, gravel crunching under the tires. That arrogant, horrible man. Susan, listen to me. Julian Reed is known for being deliberately cruel. I've read about him. He thinks it makes for good TV when the competition episodes air. It doesn't matter why he did it, Susan said. The point is he was right. I had no business being there. That's absolute nonsense, Beth snapped with such force that Susan looked up in surprise. You have more raw talent than half the trained singers I've ever heard. So what if you're not some 22-year-old with a conservatory degree? Music isn't about credentials, it's about making people feel something. Susan wiped her eyes. Well, I certainly made them feel something today. Second-hand embarrassment, probably. Beth started the car again, pulling back onto the road. This isn't over, Susan Clark, not by a long shot. But Susan knew it was. She would go back to her quiet life at the library. She would care for her mother. She would sing only in the shower, or when she thought no one could hear. And eventually, today would become just another painful memory, a reminder of what happened when you reached beyond your place in the world. The morning after the audition, Susan woke with swollen eyes and a heaviness in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Julian Reed's cutting words over and over in her mind. Susan? Her mother's voice called from downstairs. Are you awake, dear? Your breakfast is getting cold. With effort, Susan pulled herself out of bed. She couldn't hide forever, though the thought was tempting. She splashed cold water on her face, avoiding her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Downstairs, her mother sat at the kitchen table, newspaper spread before her. At 72, Rose Clark remained sharp as a tack despite her physical limitations. She looked up as Susan entered. You look terrible, Rose said bluntly. I take it the audition didn't go well? Susan poured herself coffee, focusing on the dark liquid swirling in the cup. That's putting it mildly. Want to talk about it? Susan shook her head, then changed her mind. The judge, this famous vocal coach, he humiliated me in front of everyone, made it clear I didn't belong there. Her voice cracked, and the worst part is he was right. Rose folded her newspaper deliberately. Sit down. Susan sighed but obeyed. Her mother rarely used that tone. Now, tell me exactly what happened, word for word. 20 minutes later, Rose's hands were gripping, her walking cane so tightly her knuckles had gone white. That man, she said with quiet fury, would have gotten along splendidly with your grandfather. The comparison startled Susan. Her maternal grandfather had been a harsh, critical man who believed showing affection was a form of weakness. Your grandfather told your father he'd never amount to anything, Rose continued. Said music was for dreamers and fools, and you know what your father did. He became the best music teacher this town ever had, Susan replied automatically. It was a family story, though rarely discussed. And why was he the best? Susan thought for a moment. Because he believed everyone had music in them, Not just the naturally gifted ones. Exactly. Rose reached across the table and took Susan's hand. Your father would be heartbroken to see you give up because some big-shot city expert made you feel small. I'm not giving up, Susan protested. I'm just accepting reality. Reality? Rose laughed, a sharp, unexpected sound. Reality is that you have a gift. I've known it since you were 4 years old, singing lullabies to your dolls. Your father knew it. Mrs. Peterson knows it. Even Beth knows it. And that girl can barely carry a tune in a bucket. Mom, don't mom me. Since when do we let other people tell us what we're worth? Rose pushed her chair back from the table with effort. Help me to the living room. I want to show you something. In the living room, Rose directed Susan to the old oak secretary desk in the corner. Bottom drawer under the photo albums. There's a black binder. Susan found it easily enough. A worn 3-ring binder filled with yellowing newspaper clippings. She brought it to where her mother sat, in her armchair. Page 12, Rose instructed. Susan turned to the page and found a clipping from the Millfield Gazette dated October 1978. The headline read, "Local music teacher wins state recognition despite criticism." Below was a photo of her father, much younger, accepting an award. Read it, Rose said. Susan skimmed the article. According to the reporter, her father had faced significant opposition when he first proposed expanding the school's music program to include students with learning disabilities. Several school board members had publicly questioned his methods and expertise. One was quoted calling him a dreamer with more heart than sense. I never knew about this, Susan said. Your father didn't like dwelling on the negative. But here's the point. He proved them all wrong. Those special needs students performed at the state competition that year. They didn't win, but they weren't there to win. They were there to show what was possible when someone believed in them. Rose took the binder from Susan's hands. The people who try to tear you down are usually the ones most afraid of what you might accomplish if you believe in yourself. Susan stared at her hands. It's not the same, Mom. Dad was fighting for his students. I just made a fool of myself chasing some silly dream. Is it silly? Really? Rose fixed her with a stern look. What brings you the most joy in this world, Susan? The answer came without thinking. Singing. Then how can that be silly? Rose, close the binder. Now I need my medicine and you need to call Mrs. Peterson. Mrs. Peterson? Why? Because you're going back to that competition. Susan laughed, a hollow sound. They'd never let me audition again. Besides, I don't think I could face it a second time. Who said anything about auditioning? You're all ready. Susan stared at her mother. What are you talking about? Rose smiled mysteriously. Beth called while you were still sleeping. Apparently there was some mix-up with the results. Check your email. Susan rushed to get her laptop. Sure enough, there was an email from the Golden Voice Competition Administration. She read it aloud, her voice shaking. Dear Ms. Clark, we are pleased to inform you that despite the confusion during yesterday's audition, you have been selected to advance to the next round of the competition. Susan looked up, bewildered. This doesn't make sense. I didn't even finish my song. Rose shrugged. Maybe one of the other judges saw something Julian Reed missed. Susan continued reading. The next round would take place in 2 weeks. Contestants were required to prepare a full performance piece, with accompaniment provided, or their own arrangements. I can't do this, Susan whispered. I'll just be setting myself up for more humiliation. Or, Rose countered, you'll be proving to yourself that one man's opinion doesn't define your worth. Later that afternoon, Susan found herself once again on Mrs. Peterson's porch, this time with a printout of the competition requirements in hand. Come in, Mrs. Peterson said, ushering her inside. Beth called and told me everything, that Julian Reed should be ashamed of himself. Susan followed her to the living room, where the old upright piano stood against the wall. I don't understand why they selected me. I completely froze up there. Mrs. Peterson settled onto the piano bench. Perhaps someone saw past the nerves, to the potential beneath. Now we have work to do. 2 weeks isn't much time. I was thinking maybe a simpler song this time, Susan suggested. Something less ambitious. Mrs. Peterson's fingers stilled on the piano keys. Is that really what you want? To play it safe? The question hung in the air between them. Susan thought about it honestly. No, she admitted. Part of me wants to show him, show everyone, what I can really do. A smile spread across Mrs. Peterson's face. Now we're talking. I have just the piece in mind. She reached into a cabinet beside the piano and pulled out a worn folder of sheet music. This is Nella Fantasia. It's an Italian song, but don't let that scare you. The melody is gorgeous and the range is perfect for your voice. More importantly, it's about dreaming of a better world, one with justice and dignity for all people. Susan looked at the unfamiliar notation doubtfully. Italian? Mrs. Peterson, I've never sung in another language. All the better to surprise them, Mrs. Peterson replied, placing the music on the piano stand. Besides, you won't be alone up there. I've called in a favor from an old student of mine who plays cello. He's agreed to accompany you. For the next 3 days, Susan spent every spare minute either at Mrs. Peterson's house or practicing at home. Learning the Italian lyrics was challenging, but Mrs. Peterson was patient, breaking down each phrase phonetically. On the 4th day, Susan arrived at the music teacher's house to find another visitor already there, a tall man in his 30s, with a cello case beside him. Susan, this is Thomas, Mrs. Peterson introduced them. He was my student many years ago and now plays with the State Symphony. Thomas shook Susan's hand warmly. Mrs. Peterson tells me you have quite the voice. Susan blushed. She's too kind. I'm just a beginner, really. We all start somewhere, Thomas said, opening his cello case. Shall we see how we sound together? The first attempt at combining voice and cello was rough. Susan, nervous in front of a new listener, rushed through phrases she had previously mastered. Thomas followed patiently, adjusting to her tempo. Stop, stop, Mrs. Peterson called after the first verse. Susan, you're singing like you're trying to get it over with. Remember, this isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about telling a story, painting a picture with your voice. Susan nodded, embarrassed. I'm sorry, let me try again. First, close your eyes. Mrs. Peterson instructed. Imagine you're singing to someone who needs to hear this message, someone who has forgotten how to dream. Susan closed her eyes. Unbidden, an image came to her. Julian Reed's dismissive face as he judged her without even hearing her sing. Her eyes snapped open. I know who I'm singing to, she said with sudden clarity. The second attempt was transformed. Susan's voice gained a richness and emotional depth that made Mrs. Peterson sit up straighter. Thomas's cello wove around her melody, supporting but never overpowering. When they finished, there was a moment of silence. Well, Thomas said finally, I think we might give Mr. Julian Reed something to think about. Over the next week and a half, Susan fell into a new routine. Mornings at the library, afternoons practicing with Mrs. Peterson, and evenings rehearsing with Thomas. She learned to shape Italian vowels, to use her breath support more effectively, to let certain notes soar while others were delivered with intimate quietness. The day before the competition, they held a final rehearsal in Mrs. Peterson's living room. Beth and Rose attended as their audience. From the beginning, Mrs. Peterson instructed, just like tomorrow. Susan stood beside the piano, Thomas seated with his cello nearby. She took a deep breath, nodded to Thomas, and began. The song started softly, Susan's voice blending with the cello's warm tone. As the piece progressed, her voice grew in strength and confidence, especially in the chorus where she sang of dreaming of souls that are always free. By the final verse, Susan wasn't thinking about technique or pronunciation. She was simply expressing the pure emotion of the music. When the last note faded, Rose had tears streaming down her face. Beth was wiping her eyes as well. My goodness, Rose whispered. I knew you could sing, but this... Mrs. Peterson closed her sheet music with a satisfied smile. I believe you're ready, Susan. That night, Susan couldn't sleep. She paced her bedroom, going over the lyrics in her mind, worrying about 100 things that could go wrong. What if she forgot the words? What if her voice cracked on the high note? What if Julian Reed stopped her again before she could finish? At 3 in the morning, she went downstairs to make tea. To her surprise, Rose was already in the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep either?" Rose asked. Susan shook her head, filling the kettle. "I keep thinking about all the ways I could mess up tomorrow." "Do you know what your father used to say before a big performance?" Rose asked, accepting the cup of tea Susan offered her. "He'd say, 'The only true failure is not trying at all.'" Susan sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. "I'm trying, Mom. I'm just not sure it's enough." Rose reached across and squeezed her daughter's hand. "It already is enough. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won by not giving up. Julian Reed expected you to disappear, to accept his judgment of you. Instead, you're going back to show him, and yourself, what you're really capable of. That takes more courage than most people ever find." As dawn broke, casting golden light through the kitchen window, Susan felt a strange calm settle over her. Win or lose, she would sing her heart out tomorrow. Not for Julian Reed, not even for her father's memory, but for herself, for the woman who had been hiding her light for far too long. The day of the competition arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that tapped against the car windows as Beth drove. Susan sat in the passenger seat, clutching a folder containing her sheet music, her stomach in knots. In the back seat, Thomas carefully balanced his cello case, occasionally offering words of encouragement. "Remember to breathe," he said as they approached Westbrook. "The audience can't feel the music if you're holding your breath." Susan nodded, too nervous to speak. Last night's confidence had evaporated with the morning light, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that grew stronger with each mile. "Did your mom decide not to come?" Beth asked, breaking a long silence. "Her arthritis is acting up because of the rain," Susan explained. "She wanted to, but I told her to stay home. Mrs. Peterson is keeping her company." The truth was more complicated. Rose had practically forced Susan out the door, insisting that having family in the audience would only make her more nervous. "You sing for yourself today," Rose had said. "Not for me, not for anyone else." The Westbrook Performing Arts Center looked even more imposing the second time around. Unlike the preliminary auditions, this round would take place on the main stage, with a real audience. The competition had advertised the event as Showcase of Regional Talent, open to the public with a small admission fee. "I'll take the cello in," Thomas said as Beth found a parking spot. "You two go ahead to registration." The lobby was bustling with activity, contestants checking in, stagehands moving equipment, audience members purchasing tickets. Susan spotted Julian Reed across the room, surrounded by a small group of admirers. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, laughing at something someone had said. Susan quickly turned away, but not before Beth noticed. "Ignore him," she said firmly. "He's not worth your energy." At the registration table, a young woman with a headset handed Susan a backstage pass and a program. "You'll be performing 15th out of 22 contestants," she explained. "Please be in the green room at least 3 numbers before yours." Susan glanced at the program. Each contestant had a small bio printed next to their name. Most listed: impressive credentials, music degrees, previous competitions won, professional affiliations. Beside Susan's name was simply Susan Clark, Millfield Public Library. "They asked for a bio yesterday," Susan explained to Beth's questioning look. "That's all I could think of." "It's perfect," Beth replied. "Let your singing speak for itself." Thomas rejoined them, cello safely delivered backstage. "They have a practice room we can use for about 15 minutes, he said, "just to warm up." Susan followed him through a maze of corridors to a small room with a piano. Thomas quickly tuned his cello while Susan did the vocal warm-ups Mrs. Peterson had taught her. "Are you sure about the arrangement?" Susan asked for the 10th time that week. They had decided to start the piece with just cello for several measures, before Susan's voice entered, a dramatic choice that Mrs. Peterson had suggested. "Trust the music," Thomas replied, running through a difficult passage. And trust yourself. A knock at the door interrupted them. 15 minutes to the start of the show, called a voice. All contestants to the green room, please. The green room was crowded with performers in various states of anxiety. Some paced nervously, others sat in silent concentration, a few chatted with their accompanists. Susan found a quiet corner where she and Thomas could sit. I just realized something, Susan whispered. Julian Reed will be one of the judges. He'll see me and wonder why I'm even here. Thomas shrugged. So give him something new to wonder about. A speaker on the wall crackled to life, broadcasting the sounds from the stage. A woman's voice welcomed the audience and explained the competition format. Each contestant would perform one piece, after which the judges would offer brief comments. No scores would be announced until all performances were complete. And now, our first contestant. Susan tried to listen to the other performers, but her anxiety made it difficult to focus. She caught snippets, a tenor singing something operatic, a young woman performing a jazz standard, a folk singer with a guitar. The judges' comments after each performance were brief but specific, with Julian Reed's distinctive voice offering the most pointed critiques. Contestants came and went from the green room, as their numbers were called. Soon, Susan was only 3 performers away from her turn. Time to head to the wings, Thomas said, picking up his cello. Backstage was dimly lit and surprisingly quiet. Stagehands with headsets moved silently, guiding performers on and off. Susan and Thomas waited in the darkness, watching as a young man performed an impressive rendition of Nessun Dorma. The applause for him was enthusiastic. As he exited, he gave Susan an encouraging nod. One more performer, then it would be her turn. I don't think I can do this, Susan whispered, her heart racing. What if I forget the words? What if my voice cracks? Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then you'll keep going, that's what professionals do. The thought startled Susan. She'd never considered herself a professional anything, except maybe a librarian. Yet here she was, about to perform on the same stage as trained musicians. And now, announced the host, please welcome contestant number 15, Susan Clark, performing Nella Fantasia, accompanied by Thomas Wright on cello. That's us, Thomas whispered. Remember, breathe. Susan followed him onto the stage, blinking in the sudden brightness of the spotlights. The audience stretched before her, faces indistinct beyond the first few rows. At the judges' table, she could make out 3 figures, including Julian Reed's distinctive silver hair. Thomas settled into the chair-positioned center stage, cello between his knees. Susan stood slightly to his right, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. A hush fell over the theater. Thomas nodded to her once, then began to play. The cello's rich, mournful opening filled the space. Susan closed her eyes briefly, letting the music wash over her. 4 measures, 8, 12. Her entrance was approaching. She opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. Nella Fantasia, io vedo un mondo giusto. The Italian words flowed more naturally than she'd expected, perhaps because she'd practiced them so relentlessly. Her voice joined the cello in a dance, sometimes following, sometimes leading. The song spoke of dreams, of a just world, of bright souls, of living without violence or fear. As she reached the first chorus, Susan noticed something changing within herself. The paralyzing fear was melting away, replaced by a curious sense of freedom. For the first time since she'd started singing in public, she wasn't thinking about the audience, the judges, or even her technique. She was simply expressing the music as it moved through her. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. When she reached the high note in the bridge, the one she'd struggled with in rehearsals, it rang out clear and true. Susan felt a surge of pure joy that carried her into the final verse. As the song drew to a close, Thomas's cello and Susan's voice blended in perfect harmony, the final note lingering in the air like a prayer. Then, silence. For a heartbeat, Susan wondered if she'd failed completely, if the audience was sitting in stunned disappointment. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then swelling until it filled the theater. Susan blinked in surprise as people began to stand, first a few, then dozens, until most of the audience was on their feet. A standing ovation. For her. Thomas rose and bowed, gesturing to Susan to do the same. She dipped her head, overwhelmed by the response. As she straightened, her eyes met Julian Reed's at the judges' table. He wasn't applauding, not yet, but he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The host approached with a microphone as the applause finally died down. And now, comments from our judges. Ms. Winters? The female judge smiled warmly. Susan, that was simply beautiful. Your connection to the emotional content of the piece was evident in every phrase. There's a natural quality to your voice that can't be taught. Mr. Chen? The host prompted the second judge. Impressive control, especially in the lower register, he noted. And excellent chemistry with your cellist. The arrangement highlighted both instruments perfectly. The host turned to Julian Reed. Mr. Reed? A hush fell over the audience. Many had witnessed or heard about Susan's disastrous first audition and Julian's harsh words. Now he sat with his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Ms. Clark, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. When you first auditioned, I made certain assumptions based on appearances. I spoke before I listened. He paused, and Susan held her breath. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Julian Reed was not known for admitting mistakes. What we just witnessed, he continued, was artistry of the highest order, not because of technical perfection, though your technique has improved remarkably in a short time, but because you sang with authenticity and vulnerability that cannot be faked. You weren't performing, you were communicating. He leaned forward. I'm curious, what changed between your audition and today? The host brought the microphone to Susan, who stood frozen for a moment. I decided, she said finally, her voice soft but steady, that your opinion of me didn't matter as much as my opinion of myself. A beat of silence, then scattered applause. That quickly grew. Julian's eyebrows rose, but then his lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Well said, he nodded. Remember that, and you'll go far. As Susan and Thomas left the stage, she felt light-headed with relief and lingering adrenaline. In the wings, Beth was waiting, tears streaming down her face. You did it, Beth whispered, hugging her tightly. You absolutely did it. Susan could barely process what had just happened. The performance, the standing ovation, Julian Reed's unexpected apology and praise. It felt like a dream. We should get back to the green room, Thomas reminded her. They'll announce the finalists, after everyone performs. Susan nodded but found herself reluctant to leave the wings of the stage. Something had changed for her out there under the lights. For a few perfect minutes, she had forgotten to be afraid, forgotten to doubt herself. She had simply existed within the music, fully present and alive in a way she'd rarely experienced. Win or lose, something told her that her life would never quite be the same again. The next hour passed in a blur as Susan sat in the green room, half listening to the remaining performances. Thomas had gone to pack up his cello, promising to return before the results were announced. Beth had slipped back to the audience, giving Susan space to process what had happened. That was quite a performance. Susan looked up to find a young woman standing beside her chair. It took a moment to recognize her as Nancy, the contestant she'd met during the first auditions. Thank you, Susan replied, making room on the small couch. Are you performing today? Nancy nodded. I'm up next, actually, just trying to calm my nerves. She smiled ruefully. Especially after hearing you. I don't think I've ever heard Nella. Fantasia sung with such feeling. You'll be wonderful, Susan assured her. Just sing like no one's watching. Nancy laughed. That's exactly what I told you last time, isn't it? Find a spot on the back wall? And it helped, Susan said. Though I didn't exactly follow your advice today, I think I looked right at Julian Reed during the final verse. Bold move, Nancy said with admiration. I heard what happened at your first audition, People are still talking about how he apologized to you out there. That never happens. Before Susan could respond, a stagehand appeared. Ms. Parker, you're up next. Nancy stood, smoothing her dress. Wish me luck. You don't need it, Susan replied. But good luck anyway. As Nancy walked away, Susan found herself smiling. Just 2 weeks ago, she'd been the nervous newcomer seeking advice. Now she was giving encouragement to others. How quickly things could change. The green room slowly emptied as the final contestants performed. Eventually, Thomas returned, taking the seat beside her. They're about to announce the finalists, he said. How are you feeling? Susan considered the question. Strangely calm, she answered truthfully. I already got more than I came for. A production assistant appeared in the doorway. All contestants to the stage, please. We're announcing the results in 5 minutes. Susan followed the stream of performers back to the stage, where they lined up in numbered order. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, but Susan knew Beth was out there somewhere, probably clutching her program so tightly it would be permanently crumpled. The host walked to center stage, envelope in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible showcase of talent we've witnessed today. Before we announce our finalists who will compete next month for the grand prize, let's have one more round of applause for all of our performers. The audience responded enthusiastically. When the applause died down, the host continued. The judges have selected 5 finalists who will advance to the championship round on June 15th. When I call your name, please step forward. Susan's heart began to race despite her earlier calm. She hadn't allowed herself to think this far ahead, hadn't considered the possibility of actually advancing in the competition. Our first finalist, David Lee, performing Vesti la Juba. A young tenor stepped forward to applause. Our second finalist, Nancy Parker, performing Over the Rainbow. Susan smiled as Nancy stepped forward, looking shocked and delighted. No. Third finalist, Susan Clark, performing Nella Fantasia. For a moment, Susan didn't move, certain she had misheard. Then Thomas, standing in the wings, gave her an encouraging nod. She stepped forward, legs surprisingly steady despite the trembling in her chest. The host announced 2 more names, but Susan barely registered them. She had made it to the finals. She, Susan Clark, small-town librarian, would be competing for the grand prize. After photographs and congratulations, the contestants were finally released. Susan made her way through the crowd, searching for Beth. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Julian Reed. Up close, he looked older than he did on stage, fine lines visible around his eyes. He studied her with an intensity that made Susan want to step back. Ms. Clark, he said, extending his hand. I owe you a proper apology. Susan hesitated before shaking his hand. You already apologized on stage. That was for the audience, he replied. This is for you. I made a terrible mistake during your audition, and I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice surprised her. Thank you, she said simply. If you don't mind my asking, Julian continued, where did you train? Your technique has improved dramatically. In a very short time, Susan smiled. With Mrs. Peterson, my old high school music teacher, and Thomas Wright, who played cello today. Julian's eyebrows rose. No formal training at all? Just a love of music, Susan replied. My father was a music teacher. He always said talent isn't about where you studied, but about what you feel when you sing. Julian nodded thoughtfully. Your father was a wise man. I'd like to offer you some coaching before the finals if you're interested. Susan was stunned by the offer. Julian Reed rarely took on students, and when he did, they paid handsomely for the privilege. That's very kind, she said carefully, but I think I'll stick with Mrs. Peterson. We have a good rhythm going. Something like respect flickered in Julian's eyes. Fair enough, but take my card, just in case. He pressed a business card into her hand. Sometimes the hardest thing for people like me to remember is that excellent teachers can be found in unexpected places. As Julian walked away, Beth finally appeared, pushing through the crowd. Was that Julian Reed talking to you? What did he want? Susan tucked the card into her purse. To offer me coaching for the finals. Beth's jaw dropped. Julian Reed wanted to coach you? And you said that I'm happy with Mrs. Peterson, Susan finished. Some things are more important than big names and connections. Beth linked her arm through Susan's. You, my friend, are full of surprises. Now come on. Your mother is waiting by the phone for news. 3 weeks later, Susan stood in the wings of the grand concert hall in the state capitol, watching as workers adjusted microphones on stage. The championship round was being held in this prestigious venue, with tickets selling out within hours of going on sale. Nervous? Asked Nancy, who had become something of a friend during their rehearsals for the finals. Terrified, Susan admitted. You? Trying not to throw up, Nancy replied cheerfully. But at least we made it this far, right? Susan nodded, scanning the audience as they filed in. Her mother was out there somewhere, having insisted on attending, despite her arthritis. Mrs. Peterson, too, along with Beth and Thomas. And in the third row center, Julian Reed sat with the other judges reviewing his notes. For the finals, Susan had chosen a different piece, The Prayer, a duet she would perform with David Lee, the tenor. It had been Mrs. Peterson's suggestion, a way to showcase not just her voice but her ability to blend and harmonize with others. 2 minutes, everyone, called the stage manager. Susan closed her eyes, centering herself. The past month had been a whirlwind of rehearsals, interviews with local newspapers, and adjusting to her surprising new status as something of a local celebrity in Millfield. Patrons at the library now sometimes asked for her autograph along with their book recommendations. Susan, David approached, adjusting his tie. Ready for this? She opened her eyes and smiled. As ready as I'll ever be. They took their places, as the host welcomed the audience and explained the evening's format. 5 performances, followed by the judges' deliberation and announcement of the winner. The grand prize $5,000 and a featured performance at the State Arts Festival in August. Nancy performed first, her rendition of Over the Rainbow, even more touching than in the previous round. The young violinist who followed played with technical brilliance. The folk duo performed an original composition that had the audience clapping along. Then it was Susan and David's turn. As they took their positions on stage, Susan searched the audience until she found her mother's face. Rose sat tall in her seat, her cane propped against the armrest, her eyes bright with pride. Susan took strength from that gaze, from the unwavering belief her mother had always had in her. The music began, and Susan let everything else fall away. The duet unfolded like a conversation between 2 voices, David's rich tenor and Susan's warm soprano, sometimes separate, sometimes blending in perfect harmony. The lyrics spoke of dreams, guidance, and faith, themes that resonated deeply with Susan's own journey. When they reached the climactic note, Susan felt something extraordinary, a sense of pure connection not just with the music, but with every person in the hall. In that moment, winning or losing seemed entirely beside the point. The final contestant, a spectacular jazz pianist, performed last. Then the judges retired to make their decision. You were amazing, Rose told Susan during the intermission, holding her daughter's hands tightly. Whatever happens next, I am so proud of you. Mrs. Peterson agreed. You've already won the most important victory, finding your voice. When the judges returned and the contestants lined up on stage, Susan felt a strange sense of peace. The host opened the envelope with typical dramatic flair. The winner of this year's Golden Voice competition is, a long pause. Susan Clark! The audience erupted in cheers. Susan stood motionless, certain she had misheard again. David nudged her forward gently. She stepped up to accept the trophy, blinking against the bright lights, barely registering the host's words of congratulation. As the applause continued, Susan spotted Julian Reed approaching the stage. He shook her hand, then surprised everyone by pulling her into a quick professional hug. Congratulations, he said into her ear. You've reminded an old cynic what music is supposed to be about. Later that evening, after interviews and photographs, and countless congratulations, Susan finally found a quiet moment alone with her mother. Did you ever imagine this? Susan asked, still dazed by the events of the day. Rose smiled. I always knew you had it in you. You just needed to believe it. 2. Susan looked down at the trophy in her hands. What happens now? Whatever you want, Rose replied. That's the beauty of finding your voice. You get to decide how to use it. 3 years later, Susan stood in the wings of Carter Hall, waiting to make her entrance. Not as a contestant this time, but as the featured soloist with the State Symphony Orchestra. She had not become a full-time professional singer. She still worked at the library 3 days a week, finding too much joy in connecting readers with books to give it up entirely. But she had built a reputation as a performer who brought rare emotional authenticity to her music. As the orchestra began the introduction to her aria, Susan thought about the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation of that first audition, the courage it took to try again. The moment she realized that what others thought of her mattered far less than what she believed about herself. She stepped onto the stage to warm applause. In the third row, she spotted Julian Reed, now a friend and occasional mentor. He had come to every one of her major performances since the competition. Susan took her position in front of the orchestra. 3 years of training and experience had refined her technique, but the essence of her singing remained the same. Honest, vulnerable, and deeply felt. As the conductor gave her the cue to begin, Susan remembered Mrs. Peterson's words from Long. Toso. When you sing from your heart, no one can touch you, not even yourself. She opened her mouth and let her voice soar, carrying with it the story of a simple woman who had found the courage to shine.